one of the reasons that I wanted to do this particular event, one of the reasons I think it's important to do this event is that many of us, I support primarily producers, authors, and screenwriters, and then expert selling services, which includes composers and musicians and so forth. And all of those people, the advantage of running a podcast, the specific reason to run a podcast is that it allows you to do production very quickly and very cost effectively. And the intellectual property that you create can be incredibly high value. Sometimes people these days, the studios and large producers are now licensing podcasts the same way that they used to do books. If you're an actor, you are in a position to demonstrate your skills, and if you're a director, you can direct people in performances. If you're a producer, you have the capacity to create many hours of entertainment very cost effectively and to make them available worldwide at virtually no cost. All of these things are tremendous advantages. You can list your credits on IMDb, which is incredibly handy. So Bruce is going to be talking about his own podcast, which is called Now Hear This. And he'll also be talking about the value from a marketing perspective of doing podcasts. And he'll also be addressing how to get booked on podcasts, because it's also getting booked on podcasts is a really good way for people to market themselves. So I'd like to introduce Bruce Wawrzyniak, who is has an extraordinary background in marketing and promoting and building brands for creative professionals. He works with a lot of professional entertainers and a lot of celebrities to actually build their brand and market them and help them achieve bookings and sell their work worldwide. In addition to that, he has his own very successful podcast, which is in the top 2% of podcasts worldwide. And one of the reasons I think that he's a very valuable resource in this particular context is because in addition to doing marketing, he's also a producer. And in addition to helping people market something, market their services and market their performances, he also does his own marketing for his own purposes. So with that in mind, Bruce, do you want to talk for a few minutes about, first of all, exactly what it is you do and how you help clients do with their marketing operations, and then second, sort of roll into a discussion about when and why and how you launched your podcast. And why do you think it's actually gotten to be so successful?
Well, first of all, Nancy, thank you for this opportunity. And when I talk about what I do for clients, you can see how there is a natural transition, as you said, into marketing myself, meaning my company, and then, of course, the podcast too. Mm-hmm. I always like to say that the services that I provide to my clients are largely communications based, and I'm defining that as media relations, public relations, marketing, the web, social media. Now, you did mention about bookings. So some people are going to say, well, how does bookings fit into that? And really, I kind of do whatever the client needs and wants. You know, I'm not one of these people that says package A, B, or C, and then you pick one that you think is closest, which means that you're getting some things that you don't really need or want. But because that's always been the foundation that my professional career has been built on, I really tend to lean heavy on that, because image is everything, you know, and you do only get one chance to make a good first impression. And so if that's somebody's website that looks terrible, and I know this is one of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight, is things like interviews, and maybe someone is looking at you and considering having you. And this is something that I do from the producer side, is saying, okay, this is someone I might consider having on my show. And then they have a terrible website. And am I saying no just because it's a terrible website? It's not the fact that it's cosmetically bad. It's just that it's missing so much, or there's so much that's poorly written, or things that are missing, as contradictory as that sounds, things that I noticed that are missing. So that's kind of a lot of what I do. And I'm serving people that are in the music business. I have an actress client. I just did some work with a filmmaker in Orlando. I have some authors that I do work with. There's someone that I'm talking to right now who's a filmmaker. There's a filmmaker in Orlando that I did some work for a couple months ago. So a lot of it really is kind of those people that are, I'm going to say, indie, whether that's music or, you know, writers who are on their own, independent filmmakers, things of that nature. And so then where this goes into me being a creator is back in 2014, I thought, well, I'm going to start up a podcast because maybe this will be a good way to promote my business. And my thinking at the time, because now, mind you, this was 7.5 years ago, I launched my podcast in February 2014. And back then, podcasting wasn't what it is now. And so to me, I looked at it more as a marketing tool. I thought, well, maybe some person will be listening in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and this guy will say, well, this Bruce guy sounds like he knows his stuff. I should contact him and see if he can manage and promote me from across the miles. So that's kind of what it started out as. And then, podcasting grew into what it is. And now it's become so much more. And because my company was originally built on serving the music community, that's why it took the shape that it did, where even though client-wise, I eventually went from serving clients who were just music to, as I said, music, authors, filmmakers, the actress I referred to, small business owners, even kind of some of those hybrid type people that are like entrepreneurs / small business. But with the show, it was very comfortable for me, meaning that was my niche, that was my specialty area, and that spoke to my business at the time. So as much as you can pivot at some point in time and make certain changes, I didn't want to blow up the whole format of the show and say, now I'm just going to interview anybody and everybody. Because again, one of the things in the podcasting industry that we have found is the more niched down your show is, the better. So an example of that is, if somebody said, I'm going to start up a podcast, and you say, great, what is it? And they say business. You go, okay, that's really general. So where do we go next? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, what I meant was marketing. Okay, now we're headed somewhere. Now, drill that down even further for me. So in my case, I have from day one always interviewed guests who are having success in entertainment, primarily music. But, I define that in a way that, and this comes up on my show a lot, where I'll say, we all have a different definition of success. So whereas you'll listen to my show and you'll go, oh my gosh, now Hear This Entertainment has had some great guests on it. He's had Roy Orbison Jr. He's had the keyboard player for Aerosmith, the bass player for Pink, the drummer for Cheap Trick, the trumpet player for Billy Joel, and on and on and on. And so you start thinking, oh, that's who he's interviewing, those kind of successful people in music. But then you're going to look, and by the way, tomorrow, episode 400 comes out. So this is really neat timing. Nancy didn't know that. That this just happens to be the night before episode 400 is coming out. So people are going to look at that. And the further you drill down into my episodes, you're going to say, well, I don't recognize a lot of these names. Now, mind you, I have had 4 Grammy Award winners on the show. I've had a Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, a Las Vegas headliner, 3 Emmy Award winners, and then people who have been on American Idol, The Voice, America's Got Talent, The X Factor. One of the girls actually won The Voice. So you're not going to have that name recognition, but we're defining success in the sense that this person is making a living doing music. And so that's why I've kind of stuck with that path of, and so if I may, Nancy, so one of the places, where podcasting really serves you is, I have found that with this, I'm making so many connections, number one, that are serving my business, right? So now we're going back to the original model, which was the clients that I serve. Well, how can I serve them better? Well, now I have this amazing Rolodex of, I'm going to say 400. I mean, obviously some guests have been on twice, but I have this amazing Rolodex of guests that have been on the show. But for people that start a podcast and say, well, yeah, this is kind of one of my goals, I encourage you to do it, because what ends up happening is you get to talk to people who you would otherwise never get to talk to. They would never answer your phone call or your email. And now all of a sudden it's, well, you're giving them a platform. But number two, when you can build it up to where you have this body of work to draw from, it becomes one of those things where there's social proof. And they say, oh, well, if all these folks have been on his show, then it's good enough for me. And now that feeds into, okay, good. So not only do I not only get to make a contact with you, but you can ask the questions. You, as the host of the podcast, you can ask the questions that you want the answers to. And, P.S., you can disguise it as in other words, it's not you asking it. You're asking it as the host, but you're not making it obvious that you're asking it because you want to learn
Because you really
yourself.
want to know too.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think is really true is one of the best reason to start a podcast is because you do find something particularly interesting. You do put time and money and effort into it. You have to have passion for it, which I think is true for if you're producing a TV series. God help you if you don't have passion for it, particularly if it's independently produced. You have to have passion because you're going to be doing it day in and day out. And you have to be passionate enough about it that you're willing to actually make the phone calls and reach out to people. And at the very beginning, you really only do have you're only going to have a first episode or first 2 or 3 episodes. So those are going to be people in your basic network. But as time goes by, your network does get bigger and you do get more and more contacts, and you do end up with people who know who you are, know what you do. They become familiar with you, and it does end up opening a lot of doors. Also, they start introducing you to people. So I think everything you said actually makes perfect sense. And it also makes, but people who are getting into podcasting need to understand, it's okay to fall in love with it because you kind of have to. I think one of the big things is people go, well, I don't want to produce a podcast because I'm afraid that, I won't be, I won't stick with it. And it's like, well, you have to truly love it. So you better do something you really care about. If you really don't do something about entrepreneurship. If your passion is science fiction, radio dramas, go do science fiction radio dramas, because you have to love this thing so much that you're willing to do it for a long period of time. That's what it's doing something so much and finding that there's an understanding what makes something wonderful and promoting it that ends up connecting you to other people who love it just as much. It's all kind of like Comic-Con, they're the only 5 billion people that really care about. Remember when Marvel wasn't like a big deal? Well, Comic-Con people always thought it was a big deal. So and it is kind of, so it aggregates over time, so it's a good marketing investment. It's a good creative investment, but I think can't be something that you just do for money. It's hard to explain. It has to be something bigger. It has to be something you care enough about to do it because you just really want to do it.
Yeah. And so one of the tips that I like to give out that I'll share with those that are on here tonight is that when you're starting, it's kind of funny. You need to fall somewhere between the middle of recognizing that you can't wait until everything is perfect, because everything is never going to be perfect. And if you have this big, long checklist that you're waiting and waiting and waiting to check that off, I got news for you. You're never going to get started. I see those people all the time that tell me they're starting a podcast. I see them a month later, they haven't started. I see them 2 months later, they still haven't started. 6 months later, I ask them and they say, oh, I'm getting, and by that point, I know they're never going to do it. So the advice I give, the tip that I give is to, before you ever press record on your very first episode, is make a list of at least your first dozen episodes.
Yes.
So if you're going to do an interview style show, actually find out, like when I started Now Hear This Entertainment, I made up a list of, I think about 20 or 24 guests that I knew I could get, not that I wanted to get. There's a difference that I knew I could get. If you're not doing an interview style show, whatever your topic is, you need to think of, okay, what are my first dozen episodes going to be? Because when I tell you, just go ahead and start, don't wait for everything to be perfect. I want to make sure you understand that you don't just go and hit record and do episode 1 and get it published and then say, okay, so for my next one, I don't know, I was kind of thinking that maybe I might possibly, perhaps. It's like, no, because now it's never going to happen. So if you get a bunch of them, I'm going to say at least planned, then when you finish episode 1 and episode 2 and episode 3 and episode 4, you're going to start feeling good about yourself that you're getting them out there and you're feeling some sense of accomplishment, but you're also not panicked, because you're looking at your list and saying, that's okay. I know what my next 7 are going to be. And as you're going to go through it, you're going to start getting more and more ideas. And now it's going to be 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 episodes that you have ideas for. And you'll have some comfort so that you'll know that, okay, I've got a rhythm here. And to one of your original questions, Nancy, was how have I done it? It's consistency.
Yes.
And so you have a verbal contract with the audience. You have a verbal contract that, in my case, Now Hear This Entertainment comes out every Wednesday. So I have a verbal contract with the audience that every Wednesday you're going to get a new episode of Now Hear This Entertainment. You could do it once a week. You could do it 3 days a week, 5 days a week. You could do it every other week. Whatever your schedule is, you have a verbal contract. And now you're going to feel better that I'll be able to deliver that because I know what my first 15 episodes are going to be.
I agree. And I also say, so the other thing I think it bears mentioning, a lot of people do interview-based shows. One, because it's a good excuse to reach out to people. It's a good excuse to meet people that you're interested in meeting. If you happen to be an author, you may decide that you just want to tell stories, and that's totally fine. Every author I know has 50, short stories under their bed, because there's really no market for short stories, but they do make great podcasts. And it could well be the case that you start basically reading your stories. I happen to like a lot of fiction-based podcasts, and I do listen to them on a regular basis. I also listen to a lot of people that there's a thing all about Agatha, where they basically go and rate every Agatha Christie movie, and it's basically two people talking about the same topic every single time. It's just a different book each week. And there's another one where just a woman who wants to write mystery novels, and so she's analyzing like all different kinds of mystery fiction. So you can make it so it's just about you. You don't even have to have guests on if you don't want to, but you can choose to. The other thing is, I just did an event talking about Backstage.com, which used to be Backstage West. Backstage.com, you can go on there and you can actually hire actors to work with you. You can, if you want, you can hire one actor just to read your story on the air. You could put on an audio drama where you have a bunch of people coming on, and you record the podcast with multiple speakers. But the important thing is that you do have to have consistency, because people get attached to them. And when somebody doesn't release their podcast for a while, I get like, well, I'm not, I go and I listen to other shows. So they've sort of built up momentum, and then they've let it dissipate.
Yeah. And somebody has a question in the chat where they say, what is the best frequency to release them? A week, a month? And the answer to that is really whatever that you can keep up with regularly. For some people, it might be, I can do 3 a week. For some people, it might be, I can do 1 a week. For some people, it might be every other week. You really have to plan in advance what's going to be comfortable with your schedule, so that that you can deliver that. Because a lot of people get so excited, they rush into it. And then part of it is because they have so many great ideas, and they say, I'm going to do it twice a week or 3 times a week. And then they get burned out after a couple of weeks, because they go, well, I'm running out of ideas already. I already did 6 episodes in 2 weeks. And they also say, like, this is a lot of work. And so there's really no right or wrong answer to that question, other than whatever is easiest for you to keep up with as it fits into the schedule that you have with everything else that you're doing and all your other projects. Because I think the most common question that gets asked is, people will say, how long should my episodes be? And I want to dispel a myth that's out there. There's this bizarre idea that runs around where people come and they say, I heard that the ideal length for a podcast is 22 minutes. And that's not true.
Yeah.
There's 2 answers to that. Number one is, there's a leading member of the podcast community who he actually did a study of the top 200 podcasts on iTunes, on Apple Podcasts. And the average running time of the top 200 podcasts was 51 minutes.
Right. That makes sense. That's what I like too.
Yeah. So it's not 22. And the other thing is that the real answer to how long should my podcast be is, once you get to the point where you're talking just for the sake of talking, there it is.
Time to stop. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in my case, Now Hear This Entertainment, my episodes are 45, 50, 55 minutes long, but I'm having hearty conversations with these guests. And, P.S., another little pro tip here is, you're going to stand a much better chance of starting to build the foundation for a relationship with someone if you're having a substantial conversation with them, like I am. By the time we hang up, I've been on the phone with them for an hour.
Right.
If you do a show and you talk to somebody and you do a 3, 4, 5-minute interview, you try and call them back 6 months later, they're going to go, who is this again? Oh, you were on my podcast.
Yeah. For 10
Tell
minutes.
me a little bit.
I don't care.
Yeah. So
it's kind of how
there's a couple tips
like
for you.
that
The running time is whatever time it takes for you to get out meaningful content. Once you start going beyond that, just because you feel you have to fill time, then cut it off.
That's true. And I want to actually make a couple more points. You can totally, if you want, record 6 podcasts in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. You just don't release them.
Yep.
Just release when you do a podcast, you can choose when they're going to be released. So you record them. You go on Zoom with, if I have like 5 actors and I'm recording a podcast on Zoom, then I might get the actors together and record 4 or 5 episodes in over the course of a day, because we're just reading. It's basically just sort of reading, and then I will publish that. I will publish it over the course of several weeks. I don't have to publish it all at one time. The other thing I will mention is, just as a quick response, Stacy asked if your podcast is commenting on novels or TV shows, are there legalities that need to be observed? So there's one of the workshops that's, and I don't know if it's one of the ones I packaged with this. I think it might be, that you can get using that link I posted at the top of the chat. I can do a podcast talking about Mad Men, or a podcast talking about Foundation by Isaac Asimov, or all Isaac Asimov's work. And that's called commentary. And interestingly enough, the First Amendment actually is pretty defensive about the concept of being able to comment on things. So if I want to talk about Pink Floyd's, all of Pink Floyd's work, I just want to do a Pink Floyd podcast to talk about Pink Floyd's work, as long as I'm not defaming them, and if I say something that's speculative, I say, well, I suspect, or whatever, you're not lying about people, then generally speaking, you're in pretty safe shores. I'm not a lawyer, and obviously if you're going to start saying really crazy contentious things, you might have a difficulty. And if the people are still alive and very touchy, that could be very problematic. But I do recommend that I specifically did a podcast just recently talking about fair use and talking about the right of publicity. And it is what a lot of screenwriters and a lot of authors, and what a lot of podcasters don't really understand, is that you have kind of a lot of latitude in incorporating real people into your work. You can, especially even your fiction work, there's been things where they have Marilyn Monroe spending a weekend with Albert Einstein talking about physics. And that's actually okay. That's not problematical. You can incorporate people, particularly the dead, into projects. And when you're talking about, you can also talk about historical projects. If you want to do something on great shipwrecks and you want to say mean things about the White Star Line that owned the Titanic, you have a lot of latitude to do that kind of thing. So it's important to know. I really think people need to know about right of publicity. They need to know about fair use. And I think they need to know about how to license music from places like pond5.com.
Yeah. And I want to nip something in the bud also right away, because I know that you have a lot of things that you plan to cover with me. So I just want to get this out of the way. I don't want to call it the elephant in the room, but everybody, as soon as they start talking about starting a podcast, one of the first things they say is, so when can I start making money? Or what are the ways I can make money with doing this? And number one, if you're going into doing a podcast and your first thought is, how am I going to make money? Then you're going into it for all the wrong reasons. And I'm not here to say, because you're not making it, you're not going to make any. I'm here to say, because your focus should be on getting the podcast started. You can't expect to start making money from day one when you haven't built any kind of an audience, unless you're a Hollywood A-lister, which I don't know that there's any Hollywood A-listers on here. So, you don't want to go into it already trying to figure out, how am I going to make money from this thing? Now, number two, because we do have other things that we want to move on to, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. Just go ahead and email me. I do have a document that I'll send to you that gives you 12 different ways that you can monetize a podcast. And the reason that it sounds contradictory, where here he is telling us, don't be thinking about monetizing right away, but yet he's going to email me a list of 12 ways to do it. That's because it just kind of gets your wheels turning, because so many people think. I just had breakfast with someone today, and she said, she was asking me about my podcast, and she said, so you must have all kinds of sponsors. That's how you're monetizing. I thought, why is that the only thing that people think of?
I don't know. It's crazy.
Yeah. So this list, and again, folks,
Yeah,
feel free to,
go ahead and upload anything you want. I think you
yeah.
should
So
be able to.
there's 12 different ways that I list on this document that I'll be happy to email back to you that show you, because a lot of it is kind of non-traditional. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think when you kind of see those things, it might almost impact, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to do this instead when I launch my podcast. So if me giving you that document helps you strategize a little bit better, that you say, once I do get this thing rolling, once I am 26 episodes in, half a year,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe I can start thinking about this thing and this thing that Bruce
Mm-hmm.
had on his list, as opposed to, I guess you just get sponsors. That's not the only way.
Right. Well, it's funny because it's not actually much different from when I started running. I started doing events on Meetup in like this January of 2015. Actually, 2009 I started doing one, but 2015 I decided I really liked teaching and I wanted to teach all the time. And I decided I really wanted to do the Meetup thing on a regular basis, and which translated into creating a lot of recorded workshops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What was interesting was, at the beginning, people kept saying to me, well, how do you make money? How do you make money? And it was like, well, I don't know. I meet a lot of different people. It's like, I like uh, this, like, it's a networking activity. So I'm meeting a lot of different people, and sometimes they need help, and sometimes I can help them, and sometimes that turns into a deal. But generally speaking, how are you guys getting out and meeting people? It's like, use a really narrow focus on how this particular thing is going to make money. And I have no idea why people had the sponsorship is what they always assume is going to be the way to make money, because that's actually the hardest one. So
That's
much
right.
easier to make money
Right.
from like just making people fall in love with the work you do and want to work with you. And particularly from your perspective, because you're doing marketing, the notion that, and you're talking to all of these musicians who had the same problem that almost every creative professional has now. They were the first people who kind of were automatically forced into being independent. The studio system went away. A whole bunch of different structures that used to exist to market and promote them went away. And then if you're going to be successful as a musician, you're going to be marketing yourself, and you're going to be finding solutions for how do you get bookings and how you find the venues that you should be working at and all of those things. Well, now every single creative is almost in that position. If you are an author, it's not likely going to be the publisher that promotes your book. If you are a actor, you're going to be doing a lot of your own work. You're not going to end up having your agent and manager aren't going to do a lot of promotion for you. If you're a producer, you're going to have to find your own audience.
Joyce had asked, do you recommend starting with an initial drop of multiple podcasts when starting and then releasing every week, or doing a drop of an entire season? That's a good question, because there used to be, many years ago, people were trying to game the system. There was this idea that if you release 3 at once when you first start, that iTunes is going to draw a lot more attention because people are going to 3 episodes instead of 1. And it's also going to help build your audience faster because people don't want to just listen to 1 and go, when's the next one coming out? That has gone away. So Joyce, I'm going a long way to say that unless you do what Nancy suggested, which, by the way, for those of you that know John Lee Dumas, who has Entrepreneur on Fire, wildly successful podcast. He's making over $1 million a year just in podcasting. John Lee Dumas, he puts out a new episode 7 days a week because he records 8 episodes every Sunday and then distributes them all throughout the week. So to answer your question, Joyce, if you can record an entire season, and that's how you want to go about it. I mean, you can tell by the way I'm delivering this, that's a lot of work to do.
Yes,
I just put mine out one at a time. There's a second podcast that I started 2.5 years ago. When I just launched with episode 1, and then a week later was episode 2, and a week later was episode 3. The time has passed where people batch, bulk release. So just start with one, unless you have this series that is all fully produced and ready to go, and you have some compelling reason. But I like the idea of, I don't want to even say cliffhanger, but if you think of it more in the sense of a TV show, you've got your favorite show, you just come back to it every week. I understand the day and age that we're in with Netflix, where you can binge watch, but I don't know that that for a brand new podcast, which
Mhm.
means it hasn't been established yet, I don't know that there's a demand for binge listening, again, unless it's an A-lister. As you build that audience and as people really develop some loyalty to your show, it's like me. I'm about to release episode 400 tomorrow. There are people who are going to listen to that just because of who the guest is. They're never going to have heard my show before, but
Right.
they're going to say, I like this Bruce guy. I like his show. Let me go into his back catalog. And maybe they'll just go back 1 week and listen to episode 399.
Right.
But maybe they'll say, okay, I'm really liking this. And maybe they'll binge listen over the course of a week and consume 6 more episodes. So I hope that helps, Joyce.
Mhm. I think the other thing I was hoping that you would talk about, and I think you sort of briefly touched on it, is the how are you actually finding guests? I mean, you've talked about, if somebody reaches out to you and says, "Hey, I'd like to be interviewed on your podcast," you obviously they can go to your website and find out how to contact you. But what's going to make you decide to actually choose to take on any guest, any particular guest?
I love that you asked this question. Thank you for bringing it up, because, for those of you that are on here that are filmmakers, that are actors, that are authors, that are any type of creative where you're trying to pitch yourself, this is a huge, huge part of this industry that we're all in. And, Nancy, there's so many different answers to your question that where I will start is with what you suggested, the cold call email.
Right.
And it's really tough. It's really tough to get my attention with a cold call email because I have so many established relationships. But the point I'm trying to make here is, if your email is very poorly written, I'm not going to bother. And I can tell you, it really turns me off if you don't address that my show is called Now Hear This Entertainment. I otherwise think you're just doing an email blast. So if you just say, I want to be on your show, do you really mean mine? Or is it, I'm blasting this out to 100 shows and whoever takes it, I'll be happy to get it. If you say, Dear Bruce, and don't try to fool me and say, I listened to your latest episode and really loved it. That was really entertaining. That's so vague. That's so vague. Tell me, you can look and see who the title, who the guest was. Don't tell me, I loved your interview at so-and-so. Tell me why you loved that interview, but then tell me why you're a good fit. Because I've seen people pitch me that have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I now hear this entertainment. And I think, why are you pitching me this? This has nothing to do with it. So when you're crafting your pitch, and I know it takes extra time, and you're going to say, I just don't have that kind of time. That's where you have to decide, how valuable is this to me? Do I really want to get booked on these shows? Because when people can tell, no, I'm actually writing to you, Bruce. I really want to be on Now Hear This Entertainment. I'm not doing a blast. I might look at it and I might say, okay, now I will tell you this, full disclosure. So I'm going to then go to the guest website. Like I said before, I'm going to see, what kind of a bio is there? Because I need to know about this person above and beyond what they told me in the email. Because again, with my show, I know that I need to fill a good 45-minute conversation, 50 minutes, if we're lucky. If things are really going great, 55. And if I look and you have a terrible bio, it's 1 paragraph long, I'm going to go,
I don't know what I can talk about for this long. Yeah,
exactly. And so, once I see that there's some real substance, once I see that there's plenty of us to talk about, I mean, I will go and I will check out their social media numbers. It amazes me when people don't have links to all their social media platforms, or they're broken, or they're on, Facebook and Instagram, but no Twitter, or Facebook and Twitter, but no Instagram, or whatever the case is. It's like, in this day and age, there's so many social media platforms, you can't be all things to all people. You can't be on every social media platform, but at least be on the biggest ones there are, which is Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Right. And people will say, what about YouTube? What about TikTok? Sure. Yes. Fine. But in my personal opinion, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are the first 3 places I'm going to look. And, if I see that you're on Twitter, for example, and you haven't tweeted anything in 7 months, that's a strike against you. I look at your website, and here we are in October of 2021. And if it says on your website, in 2021, Nancy is going to be doing such and such, I think, well, we're 10 months in. Like, I want to know what Nancy has been doing all year. So those things go a long way with me when I'm looking at someone and I say, you know what, there's so many other people I could get. And so, to go off question a little bit, instead of the way you pointed it, yeah, a lot of how I find my guests is referrals, from guests that I have, from networking that I do. Occasionally, someone will come on my radar, for all the right reasons. And that could really vary, but it's the same time, I'm still going to kind of look these people over and say, somebody mentioned this person. They said I should take a look. I'm going to be as comprehensive looking at them as I am the cold call email person,
Yeah.
because they still have to meet all those criteria for me. If you're an 18-year-old singer and you've never released any original music, we're not going to have a lot to talk about. So it's just not a fit. I don't care how good your voice is. I don't care that you won your whatever local singing competition. We can't make a show out of that.
I agree. And one thing that I always do, and because when I'm doing the online workshops on a regular basis, is I Google people. And one of the reasons I've in one of the workshops I've done, I've talked about how to run press releases online, so that when people Google you, they see relevant information. If I Google somebody, and especially if they're in entertainment, or they're a producer, or they're and I can't find anything about them, it's like, well, I don't know what you're doing for a living, because if I Google you, I should be able to find you. And what I read about you should indicate that you're doing what you do professionally for a living.
Yeah.
And if the only place I can find any mention of you is on your website, then I'm thinking, what if I don't know, I'm not getting enough external validation. And I like it when people have a good LinkedIn, because I need to be able to look at them and go, okay, this guy has references from these other people and they're on LinkedIn, and I can go track back to them as well. So, which sets LinkedIn apart from all the other, because it is for business people, and it does actually show you who's recommending who, and what the business relationships are. So not having enough information about yourself just really like in my experience, makes it really hard for you to do any kind of marketing. There's like this prep work that has to be done before you start marketing, because people are going to Google you. People are going to look for your Facebook. They're going to look for all of these elements to prove that you're actually in business doing what you say you do.
Yeah.
And if it's not there, it's hard to get anybody to want to stand behind you and talk about you, or to tell their audience about you, because there's nothing to talk about.
And that's what also helps, when you're doing a podcast, that's what helps you get the guests like I'm talking about, is people have such a good experience with your show that they want to help you and help a friend of theirs. So they're happy to make this connection and almost make a recommendation for you, and say, hey, Bruce is a great guy. He's got a great show. I know that you'll love his show. You should be on it. I mean, I do a lot of stuff on location also, where I'll be at a songwriters festival. I'll be at a trade show. I'll be at a conference. And so I will interview people on the spot. And that kind of is nice in the sense that I was just describing, where I'll interview someone, and it might be somebody that I already know, but they will say, do you know that so-and-so is here? And I'll say, I got to admit, I don't know who that is. And they give me their whole, and then they say, you two should meet. But I also like it because it gets me out in front of people. It gets me meeting new people. And it kind of gives me this qualified pool to draw from, where, we've all attended conferences where you look in advance and you see who's going to it. And so you start checking all the people out. And so it's like you just said, Nancy, here's an opportunity to see, like, who are you and what do you do above and beyond what your website tells me. And so for me, I can look and I can say, I'm going to this event in 2 months in Nashville. I want to interview this person. So, the time to contact that person is now, and say, I see we're both going to be at insert event here. You don't wait until you get there and then hope that you're going to find the person. And all of a sudden, on a spur of the moment, have the same availability to say, let's do it. Let's sit down and do an interview now. No, they don't have that kind of time. You should have booked it a long time ago. So those have been really successful for me. And, everybody's always asking me, and I want to qualify what I'm about to say. I'm not trying to all of a sudden blow up my numbers. We're really, this is awesome. We have 28 people on here right now, which is fantastic. At the same time, 28 people is not going to change my Instagram life. What I'm about to say is, go to my Instagram account and steal ideas from me, because What I do is I only put out an episode 1 day a week, and yet I manage to find 7 days a week something that I'm always able to post on my Instagram account. And so when you go on location to events and you're meeting people, you're recording interviews, you're doing all this networking, those are terrific opportunities. I will see people who I interviewed 3 years ago, and I'll say, come on, let's get a picture. And I take a picture with them and I post it on Instagram and I say, here I am with John Doe, who is a guest on episode number 123. If
And
you
here's the
never
link.
heard it, go back and listen to it. So now I'm promoting past episodes, but it also gives me kind of that opportunity to go, okay,
Mhm.
I don't have to worry about what am I going to post on Instagram today, because it's so crowded out there that I'm very much a subscriber to the out of sight, out of mind mindset. So if you only post 1 day a week when your episode comes out, it's like, are people even seeing my posts at this point? Because I'm not giving them a lot. So I'm going to
I
put in the
100%
chat
agree.
here. This is the podcast website, and if you go on there, you'll see all the social media handles. But like I said, I encourage people. I'm very much about helping people. So when I tell you what I just put in there is the Instagram handle. When I encourage you to follow me on Instagram, when I encourage you to sign up for my newsletter, it's not because I'm trying to blow up my numbers. It's because I'm genuinely interested in helping people, because I've been there and I've been at the place where you say, I have nothing. I don't know what to post about. And then you see people and you go, like I said before, this person hasn't put anything on Twitter in 7 months, or gee, I looked at this person's Instagram and they haven't put anything on Instagram in 6 weeks. I hope they're okay. Or what happens is someone says, I wonder if this person is even still doing music anymore. I wonder if this person is even still making films anymore. I wonder if this person is even still promoting their book anymore. So you could potentially lose an interview opportunity or some other opportunity related to whatever it is that you create, because someone looks and sees, well, they don't really seem to be posting anything.
They don't seem to be active. It's like there's got to be sort of a
Yep.
proof of life, that people are busy and keeping active. Which actually, one thing you talked about just recently was conferences, and I was surprised because I didn't realize how many podcast conferences there were, and yet, because you mentioned that there were, I started looking around, and that is like, there are a lot of podcast conferences. That's like this whole industry that people don't even know exists, and they must be the friendliest people on earth, because
very much so.
It's like not like TV people,
Yeah.
or
So
film people can be a little standoffish.
in August, I was in Nashville for Podcast Movement, which is the biggest podcast conference out there, followed very closely in second place by Podfest, which is actually coming up in a month in Tampa. Podfest Origins, they're calling this edition. They're actually going to have it at the arena where the hockey team plays, at Tampa Bay Lightning. But you're right, Nancy. I mean, I've spoken at DC Podfest, which, as its name implies, is held in Washington, DC. I've spoken out in Los Angeles at the Outlier Podcast Festival. So there's podcasting events that take place all over. And because of COVID, as we know, so much has got pushed online that, if you look closely enough, you can find online podcasting events, conferences, webinars, whatever you want to call them, to participate in. But, I even encourage you to just join a Facebook group for starters, just to kind of be around, in quotation marks, be around other podcasters. The conference that I just mentioned, I think the Facebook group is either called Podfest, or it might actually be like Podfest Multimedia Expo. But if you go on Facebook and just look for Podfest, like, that's a good Facebook group to join. Everybody's very active. They are very friendly, Nancy, like you said, because it's a bunch of indie people that are all just trying to help each other out. And there's still, understandably, there's still people that aren't comfortable going to an in-person conference. They're doing Podfest Origins hybrid. So they're doing an online component and then the in-person in Tampa. But there's lots of places to go. And here's another tip that I want to give out around this. I find it funny when I see podcasters trying to promote their podcast to other podcasters. That's not who your audience is. So go in these podcasting Facebook groups to learn from each other and to get your questions answered, not to spam the group with listen to my show, listen to my show, listen to my show. Your audience is elsewhere. So who your audience is. I'm trying to find people who are fans of the guests that I'm interviewing or fans of music interviews, those people aren't going to be in a group that's designed for people who are talking about podcasting.
Right, exactly. Well, but that's a lot of people kind of get confused about that the notion, who is my audience? The audience is, if I'm doing a podcast on science fiction, I want this people to read science fiction books, people go to science fiction movies, not people at a podcast festival who probably have their own podcast, and probably, if you find another science fiction podcast guy, they might follow you, but how many of them are really going to be that? Yeah. So somebody actually mentioned, I don't know if you've seen about Clubhouse. I don't think I've used Fanbase, but I don't know if you ever saw Clubhouse go by, and I'm not sure how strong a platform it is these days, but it was basically, the notion was that you'd get a bunch of people on and they just run an ad hoc talk show. And people said, well, that's going to replace podcasts. And there's several reasons that it didn't. One, you weren't allowed to record any of the content that you created. Two, you couldn't distribute it. And three, you couldn't really have too much control over the content that was delivered, because it was the platform kind of insists that it be very talk show based. One of the cool things about doing podcasts, as you just alluded to, is the fact that when you create a particular podcast, by and large, it's evergreen. If I'm doing Agatha Christie's, an Agatha Christie support show, and I'm saying, this is the podcast about Crooked House, anyone who has ever loved Agatha Christie, and anybody who's read The Crooked House or might conceivably want to, for the duration of time, will find that podcast interesting. So the content is evergreen. And the same thing, like you talk about Roy Orbison's son, or when you interview a particular artist, anybody who finds that style of music interesting, or anybody who finds that particular artist interesting, they're a target for your podcast. So, and the podcast is waiting for them forever. It just sits up, you basically, once you've launched it, anybody can go onto iTunes and look for it, or onto the Google Podcast platform, or go on to Spotify if you've made it available on those kinds of platforms. And somebody asked, what does the word evergreen mean? It means that it doesn't get old. If I do something, let's say I want to do something that is a book about an election, or I did a book about an election in a 1935 political run in Iowa. Well, it may be kind of dated, but by and large, music tends to be kind of a thing where if you're interested in old-timey music, or you're interested in country music or rock music, and particular genres, then if you find a podcast that's talking about a particular star that you find interesting, or a particular brand of music you find interesting, you're going to sit and listen to it. So it's evergreen in the sense that it doesn't get dated, it doesn't get old, people don't reject it. It's not only of interest to people at a particular time. They're of interest forever.
I want to say thank you to Queen Victoria, who said that she's following me on Instagram. Thank you.
That was beautiful. So I think it was cool that you mentioned those podcast shows, because I don't think people even know that they exist, and I think they are incredibly helpful. And if people do decide to do an interview format show, can you talk a little bit about how as a host you manage the guest, and also sort of bring out the best in them? And also, you also gave a tip last time we met about how you make it so when you're talking about to a guest for one show, you might be able to promote other shows that you've done.
Yeah. I love that little trick.
Mm-hmm.
How I guide the conversation is really a cooperative, in that I invite the guest to send me talking points in advance, so that, number one, they're going to feel good that, okay, he's going to talk about the things I want to talk about in such a way that it's not one big fat commercial where the entire thing is just promoting, but understanding that, and I will explain to them, look, I have a lot of listeners who are aspiring performers that listen every week to learn from me and my guests. and then I will ask them a question that kind of sets them up for
Mhm.
success because they know why I'm asking that question. I think what was happening in the early going is I would just ask those questions and I
Mhm.
would say, how did you get your latest recording project entirely crowdfunded? And they would say, oh yeah, I was really blessed. I used Kickstarter, and boy, um, I'm really thankful to everybody who did it. And I say, okay, but we want to know why did you choose Kickstarter? Why didn't you choose another crowdfunding platform? How
Right.
difficult was it to go into full-blown self-promotion mode for 30 days?
Mhm.
And so they understand, okay, Bruce actually wants the mechanics. So the
Mhm.
way that you're going to get better answers out of your guests and get the conversation to go where it wants to go
Mhm.
is you need to lead them there. And the questions have to be that specific so that they're
Mhm.
not misinterpreted. And it is okay, especially because with a podcast, you can do post-production, so you can edit stuff out.
Mhm.
I have asked a guest a question and they have given me an answer where I've thought, I don't even know what
What you
they're
just talked
responding to
about.
because
Yeah.
this has nothing at all to do with what they just asked. Sometimes, more times than not, I'll be polite and I'll let them finish. And then I'll re-ask the question and kind of put emphasis on the words that are really going to register with them that they blew it. And sometimes I'll just cut them off and say, no, hold on. What I meant was, and I'll basically say the same thing again. Um, and then you asked about my little trick of
Mhm.
how I can kind of this really makes you a better interviewer. So if you're listening to what your guests are saying, number one, it's going to serve you well because they'll know that you're dialed into the conversation, but it'll
Mhm.
help you ask better follow-up questions. So even if
Mhm.
you have some bullet points that you've kind of made as notes for yourself that you want to ask during the conversation, that's great.
Mhm.
But by really being dialed in, you'll ask some even better follow-up questions. But then
Mhm.
the trick is because you're listening so intently, someone's going to say something where all of a sudden it's going to turn a light on in your head, and you wait for that break. You wait until the
Mhm.
guest is done. And so what I've done, this is actually a pro tip as it relates to audience building. So if you
Mhm.
use the example that I mentioned before, where tomorrow, when I publish episode 400, there are going to be people who are going to come to that episode just because of that guest. If I'm on that episode saying, gee, Nancy, that reminds me a lot of episode number, and you say the
Mhm.
episode number, who the guest was, we talked about that on that one, and he said, or she said, and I will blatantly come out and say, listeners, if you never heard that one before, go back and listen to episode number such and such with insert guest name here. And then I'll follow it up with, I'll put a link to that episode on the show page for this
Mhm.
episode at nhte.net. That way,
Mhm.
when they go to that episode that they're listening to, they see the show notes and then they look at the bottom and it says related and or mentioned episodes. And there's links to those. So what's going to
Mhm.
happen now is they only came to hear that one guest, but because Bruce referenced this other interview, they're going to go and listen to that one. And then what happens when they listen to that one? They hear me saying, gee, that reminds me a lot of episode number. And so now they're going and you're sending them down this trail where subconsciously what's happening to them is they had initially just come for that one guest. Now they're saying, I like this Bruce guy and his show. I'm just going to subscribe or follow and listen to all his shows from now on because I'm
Mhm.
getting so much benefit from going back and listening to all these other ones he directed me to.
I think that that's really good advice, and I also think that it's again another reason why you have to be really kind of passionate about the thing that you're doing, because you need to be able to be consistent enough that there are connections between the episodes, and the questions that you're asking from one episode to another are related enough that you can say, yeah, this producer talked about how he did his marketing and how his most successful project was actually based upon a book that was fan fiction. But it had thousands of people that downloaded it. And who else said that was this other guy. So then you can talk about that other
Yeah.
creative. But if you're not really focused, then you don't really have the capacity. There's not relationships between the episodes. And also the users, or I should say the listeners, aren't able to follow that thread, and they're not all
Yeah.
there for the same thing, right? It's not just they don't know, they don't have it in mind that they're trying to build their business or learn how to market or learn how to be a successful musician. There's not that focus in the piece. So focus is
Yeah.
important in your work, I think.
And I think what happens
Mm-hmm.
in the mind of the listener is if they hear me talking to a guest and I say, we had a similar conversation in episode number such and such, there's a tendency to say, well, why would I go and listen to someone else say essentially the same thing? Well, number one, it's not going to be
Mm-hmm.
the same thing. And number
Right.
two, when you've got some credentials behind it and you say, Go back and listen to my episode with Eva Gardner. She's the bass player for Pink. People go, oh, well, if she's the bass player for Pink, I need to hear what she has to say.
Right.
Someone's asking, how do you keep track of all this, the references? Sadly, I just have one of those bizarre mental Rolodexes where, and like I said, it's being such a good listener, but I'm so intimately involved. You know, I want to full disclosure here. I'm chief cook and bottle washer. Now Hear This Entertainment is me, myself, and I. So the three of us are doing this. So I'm the one that's booking the guests. I'm the one that's doing the interviews. I'm the one that's doing the post-production. I'm the one that's promoting it. So when you're that closely attached to it, and yes, you know, after 7.5 years and 400 episodes, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I remember every guest and every episode number, but you remember enough of them. And, you know, a lot of what you'll see on Instagram, I mentioned before about following me on there, is just tonight, I was making my post and I was commenting on other. See, here's a little trick that I do. On that Instagram account, I only follow people who have been on the show because it makes it easier for me to keep up with what they're all up to. That way, when I travel to a city, I can have lunch with one of them and say, so I saw that you're doing this, or I can comment on their post like I did tonight. And it just helps you keep that relationship with them. And then they do stay more top of mind. So when you say, you know, how can you remember all this? It's that interactivity that really helps. It keeps those people top of mind. And so the next time you hit that record button, maybe you just commented on this person's Instagram post the day before and this person's 2 days before that. And so they're really more top of mind, and you're more apt to bring them up in conversation. You're watching what they're up to, and those conversations stay with you. And, you know, the great interviews, those will be tough to forget. The ones that weren't so great, you probably won't be referencing.
You don't want to send anybody to those ones anyway. Yeah. No, I think that is actually like, is totally true. And having the understanding the relationships between the episodes has a lot to do with you being the only one that does it. But that's one of the unique things about podcasts is you can be a sole producer. You can actually choose to be the project alone and then bring people on, which is one of the things I really like about it. And, you know, right, I don't know, looks like we're sort of staring down the barrel of a big strike here in Hollywood. There's a lot of independent filmmakers who have sort of been sidelined or benched by COVID, as well as a lot of screenwriters, as well as a lot of actors. The cool thing about podcasts is if you want to get back to work, you can actually get back to work. And the content that you create does have value. It has significant value. And you know, when you're doing fictional stuff, you may very well want to use, you may very want to have lead-in music or trailer music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You might want to have musical interludes. You know, you have elements like, or you might want to have sound effects. You can have tools like Pond 5, where you can purchase and download those kinds of effects and that kind of non-PRO music. Where you basically pay the musician for all rights. And then once you can actually build these shows. So you don't have to wait to produce, and you don't have to spend $1 billion to produce, and you can get the IMDb credits that you need. And you can do all of that without the risks and the hassles of having to do something more expensive at this particular time. So now's a good time to start a podcast, specifically because there's just a lot of challenges for people that used to be, let's just fling together a short film. That used to be just a no-brainer thing. Let's just do a short film this weekend. That's just not the world we live in right now.
Well, but with podcasts, there is such a low barrier of entry that it should almost be, why not start a podcast instead of why should I? I want to answer this question that's been sitting here for a while from Stephanie Bell. She says, do you think a roundtable type of podcast is viable? Is there a number of too many people on it? Ours involves 3 generations sharing thoughts on topics of the day. 3 is very viable. Yes. Is there such a thing as there becomes too many people? I think so. And for a few reasons, one of them being that, you know, if you come out of the gate and you have 5 people that are all on the show, and 5 weeks into it, somebody gets transferred out of town and they're going to say, this is a new job, I'm not going to have time for the podcast. Well, now you lost somebody. Are you replacing them, or what's happening? And then 3 months later, a couple of them are fighting. Somebody threatens to quit. So, you know, there can be a thing of where there's too many. 3 is manageable. You just have to be careful that it doesn't become where these 2 people talk all the time. This person is rarely heard from, and that person feels left out. And then it does become turmoil. You know, the reason that I'm not a huge fan of having 2 or more hosts is simply because of availability. So if you
Yes.
think back to the beginning of this webinar, I talked about that one of the keys to my success is consistency. I don't have to rely on anybody other than finding guests. Because I do everything myself, I don't have to say, well, my co-host is sick, so I'm doing it alone this week, or my co-host is sick, we're going to skip this week. So 3, don't misunderstand me. 3 is viable, and a round table type format is definitely doable. There's a lot of people that are doing it, in terms of sports podcasts. And then there was also a question from Joyce, about numbering your episodes.
Right.
That's one thing that I'm not thrilled with that I do. Because a lot of people will say, don't number your episodes because nobody's going to go and search for an episode number. However,
Except
what
they
I
do
do
in your
is,
case.
well, but my episode number is followed by the guest name.
I
So
see.
again, some people might say, well, some of these people that we've never heard of, who's searching for their name? And that's a fair argument. Some of the bigger guests that I'm getting, people are searching for their name. At the same time, when someone does search for the person that isn't that well known, I'd like to think that my podcast is going to come up now because I'm on Google Podcasts. They're going to push their own content up there. So you're going to see Google Podcasts high in the search results. So if someone is searching for that person that isn't that popular, that being said, there's another tip I want to give out. So we talked about numbering the episodes. I want to talk instead about the description of your episodes, because a little test that you can do is if you, and I'm sorry, we're supposed to say Apple Podcasts. Apple doesn't want to sing iTunes. However, I'm old school. And so on my laptop, I have iTunes installed. And so I'm always looking at iTunes. And the test is if you look at a podcast and you go down and every description is either the exact same because they just keep popping, copy paste week after week, or I should say episode after episode, or they're typically about the same thing. For instance, in my case, if I was every week, let's just say for sake of argument for this example, let's say I was always saying a singer, songwriter, guitar player from Nashville who released, and then all of a sudden it's cut off. A singer, songwriter, guitar player from Nebraska who so if you're going to see that, you're going to go, these look like they're probably all the same thing, when in fact they're not. So you want to challenge yourself to lead with the best information at the front before it does get cut off. And you can check it on different platforms. But like I said, you also don't want to get repetitious because you want someone to see it and go, oh, wait, what is this? She won The Voice in season number such and such. People go, oh, wow, this person won The Voice. Who is it? And they're going to read more of the description.
If you can drop a name of a popular brand or a popular, popular brand or popular band or popular movie or popular, get the name brand up first, because my experience is that really bumps the number of people that are interested in the particular topic. And I think a lot of times people don't do that because they assume everyone's going to read the entire blurb. But why would you if you don't like what's in the first 6 words,
Yeah. And there's such a thing as some people will try to game the system and they will try to fill with keywords and they'll do keyword stuffing in their episode title. Sometimes they'll do it in the description of their podcast, and Apple will crack down on that and they will, for all intents and purposes, boot you off the platform altogether. So just be genuine, be honest. Be
don't
accurate.
be putting the word jazz on it. If you're doing something with jazz, don't put jazz on every 5th word. They don't have, the description has to be an actual description like a normal human would read. And part of it's because people complain, and that's what gets you booted. And I think, if you go and you look on, if the best way to go find podcasts is to go on to Apple Podcasts or the Google podcasting platform or Spotify, and to search for, or actually you can get them listed on Amazon these days as well. So, if you go to, so you're going to learn about this when you actually get the documentation that comes with this particular event, if we just download the stuff that I told you to download. But one of the things we talk about is the fact that you're going to post it on a particular site. Like I use transistor.fm, that they host my content. But then you basically go to amazon.com and you say, hey, I have a podcast. You go to Spotify and say, hey, I have a podcast. You go to Podbean, say I have a podcast, Google Podcasts, iTunes. You go to all of these different sites, and you say I have a podcast, and then it gets picked up by all of those other platforms. So it's all of a sudden it's sort of all over the world. And then every time you put out a new episode, it automatically gets broadcast to all of those same places. So it when you're trying to put out a movie or something like that, getting it on a bunch of screens is really hard, or getting it onto a bunch of platforms is really hard. It's really easy with a podcast. It has the best distribution. And when you're looking for a podcast, if you go onto those platforms and you type in keywords that you're interested in, a lot of times you will find, like I typed in Agatha Christie, and that's how I found the Agatha Christie, thing. And you listen to 3 or 4 or 5 podcasts, or 10 or 20, and then you find 2 or 3 that you really love, and you just want to listen to it all the time. So not every podcast is going to be of interest to every single person. Not the format won't always be something that you like. Oddly enough, there was this mother and daughter pair, and they did one on cozy mysteries, and I really loved it. It was just this mother and daughter talking about, I went on their podcast. I liked it so much. It was amazing. And it was just this mother and daughter, and they ended up straying away from talking about mysteries to all kinds of different things. But what attaches you to a podcast is what's unique about it. So it's okay if you don't like all podcasts, because you're not going to like all podcasts. And it's okay if people don't like your podcast. The important thing is that you like it, so you keep doing it, and that you figure out how to market it so people who like the kind of podcast that you do will sign up. If you like doing commentary on Mad Men, then do a Mad Men podcast. And you can pick all kinds of topics, but it has to be something you're passionate about, and you have to make sure that it's something you have to promote it so that other people can find it if they're passionate about it.
Well, and it has to be something that you want to establish your expertise in. So like I said, in my case, I launched in February 2014 because I thought if people hear me talking about success that I've had with clients, or a guest tells a story and I say, I ran into a similar situation with one of my clients when XYZ, people are going to say, okay, this person has some level of expertise. And then whatever it is that you're looking to do, your business, your product, your service, they're going to want to engage with you in some way because you've established a level of expertise. Now, that's not to say that you can't just have the fun podcast. Like I said, the example before about a roundtable where it's just 3 people who are talking about their favorite sports team every week or whatever it is. But I think that's another impetus for starting a podcast, is to say, I want to get myself established more as an expert in my industry. I do have a lot to say about it, like you're saying, Nancy. And so then you launch and people see that, okay, this person is a reputable source. I've checked them out, right? So now it's a callback to you saying not just their website, I've checked them out and I am listening and learning from them. So all of a sudden it's, this person is helpful to me. I find value in this person's podcast. They seem to be an expert in insert topic area here.
I think that's definitely true. And I think particularly when you're a creative professional, if you're a screenwriter, you don't have a way for anybody to actually hear actors saying the words that you want to put in their mouths. How good a screenwriter could you be? Right? I mean, that's part of the thing is, it used to be you'd say, put up a play. Doing a podcast lets a screenwriter show his ability to write great dialogue, write great stories that are portrayed by multiple people. Podcast is a great way for an author to like Stephen King could probably do a killer podcast. When you let it, I didn't even check to see if he has one, but the point is he'd be killer for a podcast, wouldn't he? Because he's terrifying. Sitting there, he's terrifying. And I don't even think he means to be, but he is. So the point is that it's a way to show who you are and what you do.
By the way, there was, I'm sorry. I was to say there was a question quite a ways back that we skipped over. How do you interact with your audience? Do they influence your subject? So I interact with the audience a number of ways. And by the way, Stephanie, you're welcome. But I interact with the audience in a number of ways. And number one is I do invite their engagement on the podcast itself, but then I do have the weekly newsletter where I will ask people for feedback. My social media posts, there are people that will email me And I actually sent out a survey one time because I thought, well, I want to be deliberate in engaging with the audience. And I don't want to say, so, there's not really a whole lot that someone's going to say that's going to completely change the format of my show. But somebody might tell me, I wish you would ask more about what kind of gear these musicians are using, or I wish you would ask people more about touring life. Okay, that's helpful for me. And I'm going to make a note of that. And I will start to ask that to a few more guests. So when I sent out my survey, I was asking more kind of, I don't want to say global questions, because some of it was really in the weeds. Which one or more of the following platforms do you listen through? Do you listen on a computer, a phone, et cetera, et cetera? Have you been listening from day one? Have you listened to maybe 100 episodes, et cetera, et cetera? But my point was also to ask people, and I had some questions in the survey where it was just, freehand answers, so they could type in whatever they want. What am I doing that you love and you wish I would do more of? What am I doing that you don't like and you wish I would stop? What do you wish that I would do more of? And so I think that goes a long way, because the audience sees Bruce genuinely cares in what we think about the show and wants our feedback, and he will use our input. I used to give out for a while, I should probably do it again, but I used to give out a phone number that I would say, if you want to call and leave a message, I'll even play it on an upcoming episode. You're giving me permission to use your voice, all or some of the recording. But that way, if people felt like, I don't want to write him an email, but sure, I'm driving, I'll make a quick call and leave a message on his voicemail line. It's just showing people that I'm not just sitting here doing the show and putting blinders up. I really want to know what the audience has to say, because I'll tell you what, podcasters get accused all the time of checking their stats way too often.
I know,
and
really.
I really don't do that. I really don't. I will do it, every week when I'm uploading that week's show. And when I see, I'm up to 155 countries around the world where I've gotten listeners from. And when I see that here I'm sitting in Florida and I have a listener in Jordan, or in some country that's halfway around the world, I think to myself, okay, that's a wake-up call. That's a reminder. Number one, I'm so thankful that person took 55 minutes out of their day to listen to this guy who's halfway around the world. But it also reminds me that, you know what, Bruce, somebody out there needs to hear something you're going to say on this episode, or something that the guest is going to be prompted to say. So it helps you stay invested in every episode and not put it on autopilot and not mail it in, because you say, there are people out there who are sending me emails. There are people out there who are DMing me on Instagram. There are people who are responding to the survey, or it's not even engagement. It's just, wow, look at this person who's listening over in Belgium.
Because
I need to do a good show for.
Because the platforms, actually, the podcasting platforms will usually tell you where your stats are coming from. So you can actually see where the listeners are coming from. And so, which is interesting, because sometimes I have a lot of listeners in India and Pakistan. It turns out they speak English, and I'm telling ghost stories a lot of times. So they find stories interesting. So it's kind of an interesting, thing that the world's a lot, people around the world are a lot more, have a lot more in common than we know. Particularly music is something that totally brings people together. And I think story tends to bring people together. So it's I think those things are very powerful, and you do discover that by doing the show on a regular basis. Before we sort of tie things up and, make sure that we actually, we've been answering questions as we go along, but I'll make sure that we'll just double back to make sure if there's any final questions. Can you talk for a few minutes? The company that you run that provides marketing and brand building and helps people present themselves correctly to the market, and then build an audience to go to their films or go to their, to follow them across all the things that they do. Can you sort of talk about how you decide who to work with, and sort of who you like to work with on a regular basis? Like, obviously you don't just take every client that approaches you. You have people have to meet certain parameters in order for you to decide to sort of, that they're ready to sort of go to the next step. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're looking for?
Yeah, thank you. I really look for people who I can get behind, meaning something that I really believe in. So in other words, if it's a performer and I listen to them and I really don't think that they're that good, I'm not going to take them on. And some people will say, hey, as long as the check clears. And I say, no, because my name is on the business.
Mhm.
So I don't want to take someone on just for the paycheck, because what's going to happen is the next time I try to send someone else to a similar opportunity, the light's going to turn on and that person's going to go, Bruce, Bruce. And they're going to remember, like, oh my gosh, the last person he sent us was terrible. And I don't want to say they'll hang up on me, but they'll politely dismiss. And little do you know, it's because the first person they really weren't
Mhm.
happy with. So I really look at people who I really believe in their talent, whatever that talent is, whether it's a
Mhm.
singer, songwriter, whether it's an author, whether it's a filmmaker, whether it's an actor. And certain stories will just touch my heart. I have an author that she's been a client of mine for 6 years, I believe. She wrote a book about her seventh great grandmother, who was an important woman in Native American history.
Mhm.
And I just see the passion that this client has. She just calls her grandmother, even though it's her seventh great grandmother. But the commitment that she feels that she has made to her grandmother to preserve her legacy, that really speaks to my heart. And I think this is someone who is doing something almost more as a mission than to make money from selling books. There's
Mhm.
another lady I have. She's an author who she was the picture of health. And all of a sudden, one day she got a diagnosis that she had a brain tumor the size of a tennis ball
Wow.
growing in her brain's frontal lobe. She had no idea. She underwent successful brain surgery for it. And she wrote a book about it and said, I'm just having the darndest time getting the word out about this book. And I want to educate people about going through something like this, because she talked about, a lot of what she went through emotionally and that type of thing. And this was an in-person event where I was speaking, and we just, made a nice connection. She gave me a copy of her book. And in that case, I don't want to say I read the whole thing, but I started reading it and it was a page turner. And I thought, okay, I'm really fascinated with this woman's story. This is somebody that I would like to work with. Location is obviously not an issue for me because I travel all over. I have clients right now in Los Angeles and Las Vegas,
Mhm.
here in Florida and in a lot of different locations. But it's really more about, what are they doing? And really, Nancy, a lot of it is how committed are they?
Mhm.
Because some people want to hire me and then they want to just kind of go, okay, well, I have him now. I don't really have to do too much. And that's not the case at all, because that tells me that you're not invested in what you're doing, that you're just willing to hand everything over to someone else and sit back and put your feet up on the desk. You have to be your own biggest champion for
Mhm.
whatever it is you're trying to do. And, yes, work in concert with me. But if I can tell that someone's really not dedicated and they kind of have more of this, I'm going to try it out kind of
Yeah.
attitude, that's a waste of my time. I don't want to start investing all my time and resources and my emotions into this person just for them to decide after 4 months, eh, I don't think I want to continue on. I don't even know that I'm going to keep this up. That's not dedication to me. And I'm way too passionate about my work and about my clients,
Mhm.
to have somebody that's just kind of, you know, testing things out.
Right. Well, and I also think that when push comes to shove, most of us that are professional creators, in the nicest possible way, where we have no other alternative. This is what we will do. If you know, I'm a terrible person, but and I have a lot of friends that are writers, and they'll call me up and they go, "I'm quitting writing. I'm never going to write again." And I go, "Good, you absolutely should. You should totally quit. Stupid job. Nobody should do it." And they, and then a couple of times I go, "Well, that's really mean to say." And I go, "Oh, like you could quit. I don't think it's possible for you to quit, but I definitely think you need a break. So you have my permission." And there have been times when I've been, you know, you'll put a lot into a particular book or something, and it'll go out, and it just people, the audience doesn't love it as much as you do, or you just can't figure out how to really make it sell. And then you just think, well, that's really disgusting, and I don't really want to write anymore for a while. And I think having the permission to say, I'm stepping back from writing for a little while because I just can't stand it. You can do that for a week or two, but in reality, most of us can't. There, you can't. I can't stop. People can't choose to stop. Actors can't. They can choose they can prevent themselves from working, and they can stop themselves from looking at the sites where jobs are posted, but it doesn't mean that they're not fantasizing on every character that they want to play next.
Yep.
And that's the thing, is you're looking for people that have the calling, for lack of a better word, or have the just, they can't stop. And you want to enable those people, because they do create great work, because they are obsessed. Generally speaking, those are the people that go the distance. And when you invest marketing in them, they find their market more quickly, and they get more sales, they become more successful. It aggregates, and you get a benefit.
That's
But
right.
Having done a little bit of marketing for other people in the past, one of the things that was most surprising to me is how many people, once you start marketing them and they start getting attention, what happens is they don't like it. They don't want attention, as it turns out. They actually don't like it when people bother them or contact them via email or reach out to them. And you're like, I don't know what business you're in.
Yeah, weren't those the desired results from the get-go, that you want more exposure?
Right. You know, when people are pestering you, that's actually good. You want them. I know it sounds stupid, but you want to be pestered. Okay. So,
well, yeah, because I have author clients that I have booked to go say to, and this was obviously pre-pandemic, to go do book signings at Barnes and Noble. And I've had it where, okay, today you're at this one, tomorrow you're at this one, and then next week you're at this location. And that should be, like you said, that should be an author that's saying, great, thank you, as opposed to, oh boy, these are really getting to be repetitious, or you're going to meet somebody new every time, you're going to sell some books. What's the complaint? I'm not understanding.
I know, but and I have to say, I think authors are the worst ones, because authors, there's something, if you're a book author, and I enjoy writing books, there is a tendency to just want to sit at home and write, and everything else outside, that's really annoying. But it's hard to sell books if you do that, though. Yeah. Even Stephen King leaves his house. You notice? I just want to notice that he appears on TV from time to time. That's not really an accident. So yeah. So I think somebody who's willing to be marketed is a really good thing, and somebody who cares enough about their work to actually do work on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Is there anything that, why don't you go ahead? Oh, one thing you mentioned to me last time, which is we should tell people, because it was a really valuable tip, that when you're interviewing somebody, you mentioned that you really, 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 really hate it when they decide that they're going to spend a lot of time mentioning their, the name of their current project, or the website where you can find information about them, or whatever. They keep repeating that information.
Yeah, they over promote.
Right. And can you tell me why that's a problem, and how you solve that problem? A good host will solve that problem for the person they're interviewing.
Well, it's a problem because you come off too salesy. So if you're the guest and I ask you a question that is maybe about something that's in the ballpark, and you decide, I'm just going to drive this right to promoting my website and look me up on Spotify and check out my new music video on YouTube, and you're giving out all your links, it's just too salesy and it feels yucky, and people are going to see through that, and they're going to say, gee, Bruce asked this, and all of a sudden I'm getting bombarded with links and social media and music digital platforms. And so the way that I control it is two things. Number one is I will tell the guest in advance, we are going to give out multiple mentions of your website, your social media, your live dates, how and where people can purchase your music. So I tell them that I'm going to do it for them twice, and they love that. But the other thing is, and I've done this before, is when a person just is relentless, I will take it out in post-production. When I'm editing that episode, I will do a nice clean edit so people can't tell what they did, because I don't want my audience to be turned off by a guest who decided, hey, I have to really promote all my stuff. I've told you that this is going to be a 45-minute interview. It's not that it's 5 minutes long and you're thinking, oh, this seems like it's wrapping up, I better start promoting all my stuff, which, by the way, you still shouldn't do anyways, because they've probably already told you, give us your links, or they have said, hey, just so you know, we're about to start. When Fred wraps up the interview, Fred's going to mention your website and he's going to tell people about your Spotify or whatever. So, to go in with this attitude that I'm going to sneak in as many plugs as I can, is very counterproductive, because like I said, it's just going to feel snake oil salesman to the listener, to the audience, and they're not going to like you. And there's a chance they may be bothered that the host let it
Or
happen.
let it happen, right? And so the thing to understand is that podcasts are recorded. They're not done live. So podcasts you always record, and then you take the recording and you put it out on your podcast system. So or podcast host. So you have the opportunity to edit every single podcast that you do. So you don't have to allow people to do things that you don't want to have done to your audience. And most of us that run podcasts don't allow that to happen. So Bruce, go ahead and just review one more time how people can find you online. If you want, you can post it in the little thing, or you can just tell people where to find your website.
Yeah, so I just put in the chat my email address again. Mm-hmm. And I'm also putting there the podcast website, because when you go to the podcast website, you're going to see a block that has all kinds of icons where not only to go and listen to it, but you'll see icons for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. So you can contact me through those. Obviously, I encourage you, like I said before, sign up for the newsletter, follow me on Instagram, and just, use this as a resource to see, well, what kind of stuff does he put out? Because if I'm going to launch a podcast, I'm kind of going into this cold, and I want to kind of find out what are some of the things that I would say in my newsletter? What are some of the things I would post about? And by all means, use that email address, contact me with your questions. I offered before that I'll send you a sheet that has 12 different ways that you can monetize your podcast. So just do me a favor, by all means, please contact me. Just let me know that you came to me through Nancy Fulton's seminar, so I know who you
what
are.
We're talking about. Yeah. Give me also, can people email you if they really need help with their marketing? Like I have a lot of people that do books, and a lot of people that do films. And you already mentioned that you do film and book, film producer and book author marketing. So if you could go, do they just email you at that address and say, hey, I need to understand how I can get somebody to help me with PR and with marketing?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've talked largely about podcasting tonight, but by all means, you're free to use that email address to contact me about that as well.
Great. All right. Have a great evening, y'all.
Good night.
Bye.